Story 1. When I moved into my own apartment, I realized I had to think about what to have for dinner every night. Story 2. It's very surprising, but when I finished an entire tube of chapstick for the first time in my life, it was instead of losing or misplacing it long before I reached the end. Story 3. When I began to stop seeking approval or trying to fit in, I discovered the real power an adult possesses. However, few people recognize and embrace it. Story 4. I was a senior in high school during COVID, so I still feel stuck in that era of my life even though I have my own responsibilities and debts. Story 5. I accumulated $10,000 in credit card debt within a year due to a short period of unemployment, low wages, and rising housing costs in my city. I feel like an adult every time I pay that bill each month. It is not enjoyable. Story 6. When I made decisions and my parents said, "Well, you're an adult. You can do what you want," I felt powerful the first time I heard that. Story 7. When I started telling friends that I couldn't go out for drinks on Wednesday because I had to work in the morning. Story 8. When everyone in the service industry looked like kids, I remember going to fast food places and always viewing the workers as adults. Then suddenly one day they weren't. Story 9. I am an adult, but the feelings of imposter syndrome are overwhelming. No matter how well I present, I truly hope nobody can see that I feel like a fraud. I am 50 years old. Story 10. I only feel like an adult when I observe the foolishness of those in their 20s. Other than that, I don't really feel it. It still seems like I'm trying to figure out how to be an adult. Story 11. After both parents passed away, there is no one to turn to when times get tough. I have a support network, but they are all around my age, so now I have become the safety net. Story 12. I feel it when certain things happen. The other day, I bought a rice cooker and was excited to use it. That's how I know I'm an adult. Story 13. If you're doing it right, you never feel that way. At some point, you might think, I am the authority in the room and need to take charge, but that is not being an adult. That is just being experienced. Story 14. When my mother moved in with me, I had to take care of her, including managing her finances. I'm 46 now, and it's hard to ignore that my family is aging and that relatives like aunts and uncles are passing away. I still remember dangling my feet in my high chair as she fed me, smiling at her youth and vibrancy. Feels like a lifetime has gone by in a flash. Now I smile at her as I feed her. Story 15. When I started managing my parents' affairs, usually an adult would handle that kind of responsibility, but I am the adult now. Story 16. When our first child was born, a whole new set of obligations and responsibilities emerged. It was no longer just my wife and me. We needed to care for ourselves, while our child's life and well-being were literally in our hands. Story 17. When I turned 36 this past March, I started to budget, go to bed at a reasonable time, prioritize myself and my son, and stop buying unnecessary items. I don't know what 36 did to me, but I really enjoy it. Story 18. No lie, at age 37 I was married, owned a home, had 2 cars, and a Jack Russell Terrier named Emmy. Story 19. The day I felt like I was getting younger was just yesterday. This morning, I sat down on a short set of stairs, knowing that I would be out of place. I got up with cramps, and I will never do that again. Story 20. Just now, at 28, I realized I have a career, a family, and a full adult life. I don't know that I fully have accepted I'm an adult, but my aching joints are telling me I am. Story 21. When I had a child and looked around the room, I realized I was in charge of what we had for dinner and what we did. It was a cool yet challenging responsibility. Story 22. I am turning 18 in 3 more days, but I have been taking on the role of paying for my own things and supporting myself since the age of 12 or 13. It's honestly exhausting, especially when an adult tells me that I am mature and wise for my age. Story 23. When you feel sad and stuck in the mundane, you long for an exciting life, but depression takes over. You find yourself simply going through the motions of daily life, working and fulfilling responsibilities. You desire a vacation, but you also have aspirations of buying a house and worrying about retirement. Story 24. I fully support myself, but I still don't feel it. It's a lot of calling mom and dad and asking adult questions. How do I cook this? Can you explain insurance to me for the umpteenth time? Wait, bills come every month. Story 25. Once I turned 40, it felt strange to realize that I needed to grow up, but then I remembered I was no longer a kid. Story 26. I'm 46 and sometimes look around for an authority figure, only to realize, oh, I'm the authority figure. Story 27. I often changed my living situation every couple of years as a young adult. Usually, I lived with one or more friends, but circumstances would change, such as someone moving in with a significant other or getting married, so I would move on. I had kept my parents' house listed as my permanent address on my driver's license, believing it was easier that way. About a year after I bought a condominium, I needed to renew my license and updated the address on the new one. For the first time since high school, it matched where I actually lived. For some reason, that felt very adult. Story 28. I am 36 years old and still don't feel very different. I have a house, kids, and a good job, but I still feel the same as I did in my teens, just with more responsibilities now. According to Google Artificial Intelligence, feeling like an adult generally involves a sense of responsibility, independence, and taking ownership of one's life decisions and actions. It means being able to manage oneself and make choices without relying heavily on others for guidance or support. This feeling often coincides with taking on adult roles and responsibilities, such as managing finances, making major life decisions, and navigating the complexities of adult relationships. By that definition, I was an adult around 15. I guess I've been an adult for so long that I forgot what it feels like not to be. Story 29. When I had to start caring for my parents around the clock, it felt as though they were very young, unwell children. This feeling intensified slightly in the wake of their deaths. However, I still don't fully feel like an adult, just a half-decrepit orphan. Story 30. I'm over 25. I still feel like a child. I will probably always feel this way. Life is hard when you aren't the smartest person in the room. Story 31. After working in customer-facing roles and serving people of all ages, I am convinced that adulthood does not exist. Story 32. I am 37 now, and I still don't feel like it. I own a few businesses and am doing quite well. My 5-year-old says I am silly. Story 33. Today, I was talking with my best friend and told her that we're really adults. We have been best friends since high school. Now our problems involve being responsible for our parents' welfare. It's kind of crazy. Story 34. When I started driving years ago, I realized that becoming an adult is closely tied to understanding your freedom to make certain decisions. Making those decisions can lead to positive or negative outcomes from which you can learn. It's all about the consequences. Story 35. When my first child was born, I was awake 5 times per night changing diapers. I thought, playtime is over. Real life starts now. Story 36. The day I planned my mother's funeral was a significant moment. She was my last surviving parent, and her death left me as the head of the family. Story 37. I finally started to feel a little more like myself at 27, and even more so now at 29. What really made it click for me was realizing that some of the best memories of my life were from a decade ago or more. Story 38. When I had to schedule my own doctor's appointment and actually show up for it. Nothing says adult like awkward phone calls and copays. Story 39. At every stage, I feel like an adult with a career, retirement investments, and a home, but I still feel like a kid trying to fake it through life. Story 40. When I took on my first management role, I was watching people 20 years my senior acting 5 years my junior and thinking, where are the adults? Followed immediately by the realization that I was now the adult. Story 41. I had to pay for my own expenses and work for college. Since my parents were divorced, I helped with laundry and dinner. I also moved out of my parents' home and moved in with my grandmother. I was very much in charge of my life, experiencing both the highs and lows. Story 42. When I get excited about home improvement, going to Lowe's feels like when I was younger and would go to a toy store. Story 43. I stopped taking medications that impaired my frontal lobe's functioning. I experienced a significant decline in maturity for several years, and it took me a long time to realize that I handle antidepressants poorly. Story 44. There is more than one answer to this. Moving to London at the age of 22 and renting a small flat with my boyfriend definitely felt grown up. Looking back, it feels like I was pretending to be an adult. It's only in the last few years that I have truly started to feel like a proper adult. I'm 48. Maybe it's the wrinkles. Story 45. Maybe when my son was born and I started my own business, I still feel like I'm young at heart. I don't take things as seriously as some other adults seem to do. Story 46. When the once little kids became youths and started to call my generation cringy, I felt knighted into adulthood, whether I wanted it or not. Story 47. Some days, I still don't feel like an adult. However, when I became pregnant and gave birth to our child, and when my husband and I got married, I felt like I finally reached that level of adulthood. It changes you for the better. It should anyway. Story 48. When I achieved the combination of a steady job I enjoy and a nice place to live where I feel comfortable having people over, it was a significant milestone for me. This was about a year ago when I was 31 years old. Story 49. When everything is under your name, if your parents are still paying for your things, I don't think you are truly living as an adult. Story 50. It happens in stages. 1. The first time you find yourself saying, I don't have time for this. When someone argues that fixing the world would be easy, stating that we just need to do something, and you can think of 1,000 reasons why it won't work, mostly due to political obstacles. When someone tells you that they've got a situation covered and you should not worry about it, but you are genuinely concerned that they might harm themselves if you don't step in. I'll let you know when I get to it. Story 51. To be honest, the only thing that changes is being more responsible, and even that is lacking in some people. Story 52. My brother recently passed away. I am 41. He was 40. Our mother passed away in 2017. Our father is 67 and dealing with some health issues. So it was up to me alone to handle my brother's affairs. He lived 1,000 miles away from where my father and I live. At first, I was angry because my brother lived very messily and sloppily. Going through his apartment was challenging for many reasons. But then I realized this is not my little brother's stuff. This is a grown man's apartment. These are his things, his belongings, his life. My brother and I were legendary kids in our neighborhood. Athletic, creative, and mischievous. All the tales and legends of our youth now exist only in my memory. There is no one to corroborate them or to share those memories with anymore. My brother's death is a reality check for me that I am also fragile. 40 is pretty young, but no one really bats an eye when someone dies at this age. It's time for colonoscopies. I am now at an age where surgeons consider risks when operating on joints. I had a shoulder repaired 3 years ago, and they told me that if I were 3 years older, they would advise against the surgery because it would not be worth fixing at their clinic. Skin cancer screenings are important now. Yes, I have come to the conclusion that I am an adult, an aging one at that. Story 53. I'm 32 years old, and I have 4 children. I still look for the adult in the room and ask for permission. I appear young, so everyone treats me like I am young. I am very responsible at home with my kids, but when I'm elsewhere, I let a real adult be in charge. I prefer not to take the lead. Story 54. I'm 43 and still don't feel like one. Should I ask my mom and dad? They seem much more adult than I do. Story 55. Not when I moved out from my parents' house, not when I got a college degree, not when I got married, not when I had children, and not when I bought a house. It was when my closest friend since elementary school committed suicide at the age of 36. That was the turning point. Story 56. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 19. I had a good job and got my own apartment. Around that time, I felt grown up, but I think I truly became an adult around the age of 30. By then, I had enough life experience. Story 57. You don't. I am 22, but I have heard this from people over 50 years old. Just do your best. We are all as confused as you are. Story 58. I lost all my friends during my 20s, and I kept telling myself to get through another week of work more than once. Story 59. I am 29 years old and just purchased my first house after living at home my entire life. I still do not feel like an adult. Story 60. When I married my husband, it feels so grown up to say husband. It also feels the same when I write out a check. Story 61. The day my dog was diagnosed with cancer, I decided to fight it. I did everything from fundraising to working 110 hours a week. I disliked all of it, but it gave my dog an extra 2 years. Story 62. After my mom died, I felt like a lost little kid and the most adult I had ever been in my life. Story 63. When I realized I was correct about how something should be done but was ignored and watched it get messed up for no reason. Story 64. I don't think you ever do, in the sense that in my experience, I am always wishing for an older adult to ask for advice or direction at times when I don't know what I'm doing. But at the same time, I think that is what being an adult is, doing your best and figuring things out as you go. Story 65. I hate to say it, but it's when you realize that no one is coming to help you do the things you need to do. Schedule appointments, your responsibility. Car trouble, your responsibility. Budget and pay bills, your responsibility. Buy groceries and plan for dining out, your responsibility. If pets get ill or injured, your responsibility. Go to work every day, your responsibility. Some people come to this realization well before their years, and it's saddening. Some people never have this realization because they always rely on someone else to do things, and that's also sad. Story 66. I'm 39, probably late 20s to early 30s. I have a mortgage, am married, and have a serious career around that age. However, we do not have or want children. Not having kids means less responsibility in general, so I feel we're not as grown up as our friends with children, if that makes sense. Story 67. I'm married, have a stable career, own my home, pay my bills and mortgage on time, have a cat, and my husband and I are getting a dog soon. I still don't know who signed my permission slip for all these responsibilities. Story 68. During COVID-19, I was 12 years old, and both my parents were doctors. They were busy at the hospital, and my father spent almost the entirety of 2020 in isolation because he worked so closely with COVID-19 patients. In 2021, my grandmother contracted COVID-19 and, unfortunately, passed away at the hospital after a month. Right after that, my mother had to take a work trip to the other side of the country, where she stayed for almost a year and a half. The years 2020 to 2023 were a wild time. During that period, I had to take care of my brother and sister for a long time. I grew up sheltered and introverted, and I had to learn how to fend for myself in the outside world. I learned to cook, clean, and manage chores. I guess I matured during this time because I am now 17 years old, and I certainly don't feel like a teenager. Story 69. I believe I will start to feel like an adult when people stop treating me like a child. I am 24 years old and have lived on my own since I was 19, but most other adults still treat me like a child. Story 70. I moved out for good and no longer had anyone watching and controlling my every move or making decisions for me. Story 71. I remember it clearly. I woke up feeling sick one day and was relieved it was my day off so I didn't have to call out. Story 72. I'm not sure I do. I mean, I have a family, purchased a house, and paid off 2 cars. However, I still feel lost. Perhaps it's because I don't feel financially independent. Story 73. When I had to stop college at 20 or 21, I was 35 years old when I earned my degree. I learned to help not only myself but also my immediate family. I discovered how to budget and give without expecting anything in return. I hope that helps. Story 74. When I began completing tasks because they needed to be done and stopped complaining or overthinking, it felt fair. Story 75. I'm only 34 now, so very recently. I don't feel like I have it all figured out, and 75% of what I find funny an 8-year-old will too. However, I trust myself to figure things out, and that's new. Story 76. I would genuinely rather starve to death in a Walmart parking lot than fill out another form. I am frustrated with bureaucracy and the challenges of adulthood. Story 77. Sometimes I look around for someone to make a decision and then realize they are looking at me. During those moments, I feel somewhat like an adult. Otherwise, like others, I'm still waiting in my late 40s. Story 78. I always felt I was a little more emotionally mature than most of my peers at a young age, but now I find it difficult to connect with almost everyone I encounter. In some ways, I felt like an adult during my early teenage years. Story 79. At about 15, we lived on a small farm where we milked cows and had a couple of horses on 100 acres of mixed crops. My dad contracted a terminal illness, which forced me into the adult role of looking after the farm, my mom, and my younger siblings. It was not easy for a teenager, but it had to be done. Story 80. When we bought a house with a garage, pushing the button to open the garage door while pulling into the driveway just aged me. Story 81. I'm 43, and I only have the occasional day of pretending to be an adult. That is overrated. Story 82. When I was 18, I had to find my own place. I wasn't organized, so my phone was cut off, and I received some late payment notices for my water and electricity. I was a student, and in my country, students receive financial assistance, but the amount was only enough to cover my rent. I lived on ramen noodles, the only food I could afford. I worked long hours at a service station to afford living. I had to become an adult with responsibilities very quickly. Story 83. When I was about 12, we lived on a farm, and my parents gave me too much responsibility that I never wanted. Story 84. I have always felt like an adult. I raised my younger brother starting at the age of 13, got a job at 16, moved out at 18, and was on my own while still caring for him. I didn't get to feel like a child until my late 20s, and I still feel like a big kid with a stable job and responsibilities. Story 85. I was 4 years old when I began to parent my parents. Realistically, I'm still not a fully fledged adult, but after having to keep track of my parents' ability to feed us, maintain the house and belongings, emotionally support them, and plan and ensure family functions and activities were being done, I quickly lost what it felt like to be a child. Story 86. At around 30, I was thrown into independence at 13. I had to navigate this new reality with the knowledge that I lacked experience, so I proceeded slowly and deliberately. Story 87. When I received my first award from high school, I saved it up to buy my grandparents some nice things for winter. I truly felt like an adult at that moment. Story 88. At 22 years old, I realized I cannot rely on my parents to save me or provide for me. I have to provide everything for myself if I want to be okay. I also recognized how dysfunctional my family is. Story 89. The first night in your new place, the first time you've ever lived alone, with no work the next day, you just have to decide what to do with yourself for the rest of the evening. Story 90. When my sister moved out of state when I was 13, my parents no longer cared about what was happening at home. Story 91. Mid-60s, and I'm still waiting for it to happen. During lunchtime today, I had a thought. I hadn't climbed a tree in decades, so I went out and climbed one, albeit with the help of a ladder for part of the way. I had really forgotten just how liberating it can be to simply clamber about in the top of a tree and see the world from a different perspective. My family thinks I'm nuts, and maybe I am, but I've always believed that life is for living. If you constrain yourself because it's dangerous, then you're not living, you're just existing. Story 92. When you are covering all your own expenses without help from anyone, you earn bonus points for also covering someone else's expenses. Story 93. That's a good question. When I moved into my first apartment a few months ago, the weight of bills, loneliness, and silence truly marked something in my mind, saying, yes, you're an adult now, whether you like it or not. Story 94. Around age 36, I went through a deep grieving process following a family trauma. My health plummeted and I developed chronic pain. After that, the world around me didn't seem to sparkle as much. It looked more dangerous and grim than it used to. I realized I was tired. I am not depressed anymore, but I am tired. My interests and motivation have become minimal in a peaceful way. Remember that book, The Giving Tree? At the end, the old man tells the tree, I don't need very much now, just a quiet place to sit and rest. I'm tired. Story 95. Funny enough, today I'm 23, and finally, after years of being stuck in a cult and escaping 2 years ago, I have cut ties with everything related to my previous life. My mom, who is a narcissist. My bills, which are all in my name now. Friends, as I have made all new and better ones. And a partner, who I love deeply and who has been my rock on this journey. We live together in an apartment that I can finally contribute to. I'm all grown up, everyone. Story 96. It's not 36 with 3 degrees, 2 children, 1 in high school, a hatchback, and a favorite stove burner. I'm pretty sure it won't be 37 either. Story 97. For me, the turning point was in a bike park focused on downhill mountain biking. There was one kid who called everyone in line to the lift bro, except for me, whom he called Mister. I was 32 at the time. Story 98. I'm 36, and I think seeing Generation Z take over, as every generation does, over the last few years has made me realize that I'm growing up. For example, turning on the radio, watching television, and getting a coffee. I have many moments daily where I think, I don't understand. Story 99. I recently turned 26, and my brain feels more mature. I feel more like an adult now, but I still feel like a child most of the time. Story 100. Maybe soon. I am 39, happily married, have a child, and a career I love. However, mentally I don't feel any different than I did as a teenager. Story 101. It hasn't happened yet. I still feel like an imposter playing at being an adult 20 years and 2 children later. Story 102. I had to look after myself and my sisters, cooking meals, doing laundry, and grocery shopping since I was 8. Pretty much since then. Story 103. When I bought a plunger for my home before I needed it, I knew I might need it someday. That little bit of preparation for my future self finally made me feel like an adult. Story 104. When I looked at my hands, they were beautiful like my mother's when I was a child. I looked at hers and saw how much they had changed from my memories. Story 105. The first time I missed a bill, I faced harassment to pay it. Nothing makes you grow up faster than financial stress. Story 106. When my first child was born, someone asked me if I finally felt like an adult. I replied no. Any 14-year-old can become a parent, but buying my first washer and dryer? That's when I truly felt like an adult. Story 107. When I stopped worrying about what my parents thought of my actions, I learned to see them as fellow human beings. Story 108. The night I received the phone call from the hospital, my wife had collapsed in her hospital room and was rushed for emergency surgery. They didn't call until after the procedure, and when I arrived, I found my wife in a tangle of tubes and wires in an induced coma, while our second child was in the neonatal intensive care unit and not very responsive. For several hours, the odds weren't great for both of them, and doctors were looking to me for decision-making, not other family members. Both my wife and second daughter are fine now and doing great. Story 109. Probably around 12 to 14, when my mom started treating me as if my actions alone were responsible for her mental well-being. Being an adult is great. I have so much freedom. Story 110. At 25, I faced challenging master's studies while dealing with the loss of a friend to suicide. The world became strange due to the virus, leaving everyone on edge. This experience truly made me an adult. Story 111. I was 15 years old when my conflicted mother convinced me to move with her to another city. Days before doing so, she left alone with her partner and her other children. I had to come to terms with being alone in a family that didn't care. So I got a job and earned my own money. It was very little, but it was enough to buy my school supplies and food at recess. At 18, everyone around me thought I was in my 20s because I was so mature for my age, and, of course, I had to grow up earlier. That's when I realized that I was an adult and that everything that happened in my life was a result of my own decisions. Story 112. The summer I was 24, I lived alone in the basement apartment of a house. The couple on the main floor was in their early 30s. They both worked at a local car plant and rented out the basement for extra income. I had lived away from my parents before, but never on my own. I had the freedom to do what I wanted and worked at a local golf course with pretty flexible hours. I paid all my bills, did my own shopping and cleaning, went on a few dates, planned some nights out with friends, and occasionally hung out with the couple upstairs. It was the first time I truly felt independent. Since then, I have had to move back home because I decided to return to school in my hometown. I really miss that freedom. I have noticed that living at home as an adult makes you revert to how things were when you were younger. Story 113. In my mid-30s, I owned a home. But at 48, I sometimes still wonder. Honestly, when I can answer basic adult questions, I feel like an adult. What is a 1099? How do you complete a tax return? What savings are best? What stocks should I invest in? What books should I read? I paid off my house. Now what? Retirement? Taking care of my mother and husband? It all makes me feel like an adult. Story 114. I am hungry. I need food. How do I get food? I need money. How do I earn money? It is time to grow up and find a job. Remember that day well. Story 115. When I found out my dad was dying of cancer in 2022, I became the power of attorney and was in charge of everything at the age of 19. I am 22 now. I would do anything to feel like a kid again. Story 116. The fall after college graduation often brings a sense of depression that many graduates experience. Story 117. I am still waiting. I am 39 years old. I dislike age regression, but I am glad many people are understanding. Story 118. When I started identifying more with the stressed-looking mothers on the sidewalk than the energetic, happy children. Story 119. In stages. When my first child was on the way at 20, I realized I had to step up and be a parent. When my father passed away at 26, I understood that I was the father now. Both were significant shifts in responsibility. Story 120. I have a wife and 2 kids. I still don't know what time it is. Seriously, it's about doing what you need to do and enjoying your life. It doesn't have to be a significant change in how you feel. Story 121. This question is asked frequently and it's difficult to answer, but the fundamental concept of what you perceive adulthood to feel like as a child is flawed. You will most likely never feel completely in control or have everything figured out. There is no specific age or event that signifies becoming an adult, but generally, each milestone of adulthood and responsibility will enhance that perception. This happens twice. Once when you first reach the milestone and again when you become accustomed to it. Some milestones can feel more challenging than rewarding. Examples include the first time your parents leave you alone, when you start going to school by yourself, the first time you buy something with money you earned, when you get your first job, when you obtain your driver's license, when you buy your first car, when you graduate from high school, when you move out, when you enter your first romantic relationship or have your first kiss, when you lose your virginity, when you can legally drink alcohol, when you graduate from college, when you have your first place without roommates, when you buy your first home, when you start paying your own bills, when you begin your career, when you travel alone for the first time, when you can rent a car, when your grandparents pass away, when you get married, when you have children, when your children start achieving their milestones, when you notice gray hairs, when your parents pass away. Story 122. My opinions started to matter. My decisions affected others, and people depended on me to make choices and provide guidance. Story 123. In the absence of clarity, it can be frustrating when family, friends, and even strangers dictate what it means to be an adult. As I observe, I notice children engaging in behaviors that reflect responsibility, while some adults seem to abandon their maturity, acting inappropriately. Story 124. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I had to drag my mother from the hallway floor and get her into bed. I attempted to feed myself before going to bed for elementary school the next day. Ever since then, I've been an adult. Story 125. Probably the first time I got excited over a new sponge and actually compared interest rates for fun. Nothing like budgeting for toilet paper to make you feel like an adult. Story 126. After I moved out, I had no contact with my family, so I was very much on my own. Not being under the abusive control of my family made me feel empowered and free, even if I was penniless. Having an apartment in my name was a significant milestone for me. I'm 25, and that happened in February of this year. Story 127. In my 30s. I'm 32 right now. In my 20s, my family would feel bad for me if I was struggling with something. Now it's just like, join the club, kid. A number of age-related health issues have begun. I am very sensitive to heat and cold now when I have never been before. I experience more frequent headaches, fatigue, and aches all over. I track my water intake and diet more closely to avoid the side effects of not being careful. I am actively investigating it, but it makes me feel like I turned 70 overnight. In my 20s, I would spend my money however I wanted. Now, I'm always planning for things to go wrong. It's good to have savings and think ahead, and I tend to be cautious. But lately, I'm just not enjoying myself the way I used to. Story 128. I am going to be 30 this year, and I still do not quite feel like a fully fledged adult. My parents are in their 60s and feel the same way. Story 129. When I started renting a house, I realized that everything was on me. I had no option to just quit my job if I didn't like my boss, and no parents to move back to in case things went wrong. If I can't pay the rent and utilities, things will deteriorate quickly. Story 130. Married, 32 with 2 children. I have a corporate career and am a homeowner. However, I still feel unsure about many things, likely more than ever before. I realize that I should embrace my role as an adult, especially since my parents have begun aging significantly over the past 2 years. Feels strange. Story 131. I'm almost 49 with a wife and kids and 2 homes. One child is grown and off on his own adventures. I still keep waiting for someone to understand what I know. I'm still a kid, just very good at pretending to be an adult. Story 132. I truly felt like I got smacked upside the head with adulthood when I was laid off during COVID-19. I had moved a few years prior over 1,000 miles away from all my friends and family to a resort town that still felt like college, so I was still partying. However, when I was laid off, it was an immediate realization of how I was going to support myself out here all alone. I faced a number of harsh realities and somehow got through it, but I have felt like an adult ever since. I was 25 when that happened. Story 133. I am 37, married with 2 kids. I felt a bit untethered when my mom got sick, and now I help take care of her, but I still don't feel like it. My parents have made it past the 80-year mark. They both say that the number continues to increase and the reflection in the mirror changes, but they don't feel their age. Story 134. When I hired my first lawyer to resolve a succession dispute beyond my control, it felt very strange to be before the judge. Story 135. At 30, I realized that even though I want nothing more than to ride mountain bikes every day, I should probably instill more long-term planning in my life. I am the same person and ride just as hard, but I definitely feel more responsible now. Story 136. I think when we finally bought a house, we had rented before and we even got married and had a child who is now 4. But I never felt like an adult until we bought our house and started getting people around to give quotes. Story 137. In my 30s, I got married at 26 and felt very young. I'm 32 now, and I still feel like a child compared to my senior coworkers. Story 138. I am almost 30 and I still do not feel like an actual adult. I act like an adult, but I do not feel like it. Story 139. As a serious answer, I am about to turn 36 and feel like an adult. I have responsibilities, but I can manage them. I have an apartment that I can afford, and it is quite nice here. I live a comfortable life and mostly enjoy my work. This is what I imagined adulthood would be when I was a child. I thought I would be married, but that is not in my future, and I am fine with that. I only began to feel like an adult 2 years ago. Story 140. I have never concerned myself with feeling like an adult. Even when you look up the definition of the word in a dictionary, there is nothing really definitive there. Each society or civilization has its own ideas about when someone becomes an adult. So, find a definition you like and see if you fit it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.